I want to welcome you again to our half-day conference today. My name is Judy Pryor-Ramirez, and I'll be moderating the panel that we have today, where we'll be exploring the nature of the problem. While I'm not going to read the bios, because we have them in the beautifully printed programs for you today, I do want to acknowledge here who's on the panel, as we're very excited to be in conversation with these folks today. On my far end over there, we have Warren Spielberg from the New School. We're also joined by Melanie Hartzog from the Children's Defense Fund. We have Pedro Noguera from New York University. We have Ellis Cose and Howard Steele from the New School. So we posed a couple of questions to our panelists over the last few weeks. And so what I'll have them do is share out their thoughts on the questions that we asked them. They'll have anywhere from 7 to 10 minutes. I have my timekeeper here, Christina up front, who will keep us on track as we've got quite a tight schedule today. Then we'll open it for some Q&A, because I'm sure several of you have questions. I see lots of folks in the crowd that I recognize that are here from nonprofits, that are here from schools, that are here from other agencies here, so thank you again. So the questions we asked the panelists to consider are threefold. The first one is, we asked them to think about and tell us in their experiences what the causes of the achievement gap are, sort of why they exist for boys of color and their counterparts, and how they became involved in these issues from their particular academic disciplines or their practice areas. We also asked them to consider this issue in the context of the age of Obama, as Maya Wiley suggested earlier. What does that mean, and why is this issue important in this current context? And thirdly, we asked them, what are the ways in which race is implicated in the creation and maintenance of the racial achievement gap, and what can be done to address these problems? So large questions. They'll answer them. Why don't we start at the far end over there with Warren, and we'll just work our way this way, if that's all right. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. And thank you, Maya. And thank you, Judy. So I first became interested in this topic, engaged, about 25 years ago when I was on my psychology internship in Long Island. And I was working with a boy of 13, African-American boy. Let's call him John. And he was oppositional and defiant, had a history of many losses. But John had an additional challenge. He was the only black boy in an all-white, wealthy school district, Dix Hills in Long Island. And he'd already been suspended twice for being fresh and uncooperative. And teachers described him as menacing and large, but he was neither. He had never had a fight, and he was not of above average height. The school wanted to place him in a program for emotionally disturbed children. And his uncle, his main guardian, sort of asked me to come along and try to help him appeal the decision at a state-mandated judicial hearing. So teachers and administrators from the school lined up one after another to report his defiant behaviors. And in turn, I asked initially, is it possible that this child has been here for 2 years and he has done nothing correct, nothing of value, nothing to be appreciated and applauded and loved for? And the answer was mostly no, except one teacher finally had the courage to speak up. And she said, no, he's doing B+ work in my class. This was an English class. And she clearly liked him, and he liked her. It was also discovered in the course of the hearings that he had a math disability that was hurting him. And that's often a common problem with many boys of color, that it's undiagnosed, these kinds of problems. So in the end, the state judge, overturned their decision. He was mandated to stay in the district with supports. So let me fast forward to the present. Unfortunately, racial bias in schools, as we know, is still very much with us. Currently, in my clinical practice, I have 2 young boys, 13 and 14, who have been the recipient of harsh discipline and rejection and suspensions at schools. Second, for our book, The Psychology of Black Boys and Adolescents, Dr. Vaughan's third panel coming up today. And I interviewed over 50 young men about their lives in school, among other topics. And they felt overall that their teachers did not like them. They reported, many of them reported, that they had unfair experiences of unfair treatment, including being singled out for discipline over and over again, always being asked to sit in the last row of the classrooms, not being allowed to go outside to the bathroom by themselves, et cetera, et cetera. In addition, the boys faced an additional burden of when they did well, they were accused of cheating. So Tony is a young man I interviewed. He was a senior. He had gone to school in the Upper West Side. He told me the following story. He had achieved a 95 on the Regents math exam, but his happiness soon gave way to dread as he was accused of cheating. After an investigation, he was vindicated. But a year after the event, when I met him, he was still confused, hurt, traumatized by the incident, and he was unable to really connect the episode with the idea that he had been the object of racial bias. He was circling around it, but found it hard to talk about it. Instead, he suppressed his feelings. He had suppressed his feelings. He had self-blamed, he told me. He withdrew emotionally from school. Teachers have a hard job, he said. Sometimes they make mistakes. Later in the interview, he said, school's not for me. I'll finish high school, but I'm not going to college. So I've stayed in touch with Tony, and he's currently in the Army, and eventually wants to go back to school. Let me contrast that story with that of Jordan. Jordan was a 15-year-old from Long Island. He was publicly accused over and over again by his math teacher of not doing his homework, of having his parents do his homework. By the way, that's a charge that, many schools want their parents to help kids with the homework, but in this case, it was used against him. So in response, he developed an elaborate plan. When given a homework assignment in the morning, he did it during his lunch hour. He asked the teacher to meet him at his locker at 3 p.m. He took out the homework proving he had done it, and the teacher didn't bother him again. But that's quite a lot to ask anybody to do, including, especially a child. Jordan had an advantage, though, that Tony did not. He had parents who had strong racial identities, who were available to him to talk about racial bias, who supported him, who helped him think about it, who helped him develop a plan. So the first point I want to make is that I believe that until schools are fully more welcoming to children of color, parents and others interested parties must help them recognize and deal with racial bias at school. And that's a sad statement to make, but I think it's very important. Dr. Vaughan will talk more about it later, but often parents have been, we found reluctant to talk about that. Next is imperative, more imperative perhaps, that we help teachers reduce their implicit bias. And those are biases that are sort of subconscious and biases that most people don't, if you ask them, they would not feel comfortable exhibiting. They don't really want to have the biases, but they have them. It comes out, of course, we know that it has impact in many, many areas. So we want to help teachers reduce their implicit bias with respect to boys of color. And we must do this in order to close the relation gap that exists between boys of color and teachers at school. And we want to help, I think, we want to help boys feel that the minds of teachers are not against them. So based on my own work in schools and in working with groups of Israeli Palestinian students over the years in Palestine and in Israel, I believe that we can do this. I believe that my experience and the research shows that biases are malleable. Stereotypes can be changed. They are susceptible to change. We can reduce them. We can't get rid of them completely. It's going to be an ongoing process, an ongoing fight, but we can make a dent, and we have to. So we can educate our teachers to become more aware of their biases. We can provide supervised intergroup contact between teachers of differing backgrounds in order to build greater understanding. We can provide counter-stereotypic training. There are techniques that can be used that we know as psychologists that will reduce stereotypes over 3 months, 6 months, even a year period. And since anxiety and conflict will increase implicit bias, we must provide greater emotional support to teachers to help them deal with the challenges and stresses and confusions of their jobs. And part of helping them would be also to get them more in touch with their own racial or ethnic or religious identities, maybe their own histories of family discrimination. This too would build empathy for others. All these things I've said have been proven to reduce bias and stereotyping. Every school should develop a plan for reducing teacher bias. Every school should be accountable for lowering its rates of expulsion and suspension. As Amaya alluded to before, if a child is suspended from school, he then stands, only a 30% chance of finishing high school. And that starts a pipeline, as Marianne Wright Edelman talks about, a pipeline from school to prison. So I know these activities will take a great deal of time and effort and resources, but it is crucial that we do them, not just for the children who deserve it, but for the welfare of our country, for our nation. Because I wonder often, how many talented and productive boys and young men do we lose to the streets every year? People who could raise families, be working citizens, or have a good life, and maybe also, help with all the problems that we have in the world. How many are we losing? Because many of them may have decided, like Tony, that school is not for them. And in the end, I feel very strongly that these boys are all our sons, and that they deserve the same opportunities that we wish to have for our children. So thank you, and I look forward to a discussion.
Okay, tough act to follow here. So before I get started, I had to just give my piece, which is I am a new school graduate. And so it's great to be back here. Thank you, thank you. Before I start, I wanted to share a quick story, which is, I had a colleague from a very prominent nonprofit organization ask me to have a meeting to talk about what are the causes, what are some of the new strategies to deal with poverty. And I found myself sitting in this conversation saying, new strategies? What new strategies are there to deal with poverty? We know what works. We've had investments and we have evidence that's based on lifting children and youth and families out of poverty. Why do we need to have a conversation about new strategies? Why can't we have a conversation about what it takes for this country to actually invest and expand those strategies so that we can lift millions of kids out of poverty? And I say that because when I thought about these questions and how do we close the achievement gap, particularly in education, to me, the first thing I thought of was poverty. And so, when we look at the most recent data that shows that we have 14 million children across this country living in poverty, and half of them are living in extreme poverty. And that to me is really striking, right? Because we often talk about lifting kids out of poverty. We think about poverty being, 100%, $22,000 or so for a family of 4. Think about living at half that amount across this country. It is a shame and it's a shock. And yet, here it is, we know all of these strategies that work, but we also know what the outcomes are, right? And so for kids living in poverty in communities that are stuck, as Maya talked about, with the effects of poverty, here's what we do know, right? One is that children who are living in extreme poverty are more than, if you look at higher income kids, by the time they are 4, these children have heard 30 million words less than higher income kids. And so when we talk about kids entering into pre-K with this type of learning deficit, why aren't we focusing more on the 0 to 3 population? And how do we really look at interventions that focus on younger children? It's not because parents who are poor don't care about their kids, who don't care about reading to their kids or the importance about their education. It's because parents who are poor are working multiple jobs, trying to make ends meet, who barely have enough time to figure out where my child needs to be, who's going to take care of my child, and how do I get from school to work and take care of my family. And that's the reality. The other reality is that children facing extreme poverty also suffer from, as Maya talked about, those toxic stress, and as Warren also mentioned. So in communities with high violence, and the fact that children are going to, or perhaps skipping school because they feel unsafe getting to school, this is the reality that children who live in poverty face. The other reality is that the younger you are in experiencing poverty, the less likely you are to graduate high school. Let me just say that again. The younger you are in experiencing poverty, the less likely you are to graduate high school. Again, focusing on the youngest children, that cohort of 0 to 3, who are facing extreme poverty, who their chances of graduating high school are extremely, extremely limited. So those are just some of the effects, and I know you all know this because I'm speaking and preaching to the choir to some extent, but what is my involvement in some of these issues and strategies to resolve it? So I actually come to this work before CDF, having launched the Young Men's Initiative under the previous administration. And for those of you who aren't familiar, which I'm sure you are very familiar with the Young Men's Initiative very quickly, it's a public-private partnership that was launched with a total of about $44 million annually in investments to improve outcomes for Black and Latino boys. And we focused on education, health, employment, and justice. And we did that because, as Marian Wright Edelman always says, children don't come in pieces. If you want to talk about closing the achievement gap, you have to look at the other systems that are impacting the lives of Black and Latino boys and that are preventing them from actually being successful in education. And so that's not to say that there aren't improvements that need to be made to the education system. I think Warren pointed out, and I am quite sure that Pedro is going to talk about those as well. But you have to look at the holistic approach, and that's exactly what YMI did. The other piece of my work, and I think we're also going to hear a little bit about YMI in more detail in the second panel from my colleague John Duvall, who's here to talk about some education work. But in my now new role at CDF, we are very much focused on closing, and I should say really restructuring what's called the cradle to prison pipeline and putting in place the cradle to college pipeline. And our work on this front comes in a number of different ways. And the first being that, as I said, the lack of focus on really looking at the 0 to 3 population, just to bring that home, here in New York City, the vast majority of children who are poor, who are receiving cash assistance, 60% of them who are receiving vouchers for child care subsidies are being cared for in home-based settings. And the vast majority of those settings are not licensed. So when you think about the fact that we have children, Black and brown children, who are in licensed, unlicensed homes from 0 to 3, it's great to get them into pre-K. It's an amazing expansion that's been done by our mayor to date, but we have to focus on getting them the cognitive, the early literacy that they need to actually be successful, both when they enter pre-K and throughout. At the Children's Defense Fund, we've actually partnered with the United Way to launch an initiative to really improve the quality of home-based care and really focus on early literacy, which is an exciting new endeavor, but I think we need more investment, more attention paid. The other piece of work that we're doing is really looking at expanding healthcare options in schools. School-based health clinics are an important entry point for children into the healthcare system, and we have far too little school-based health clinics in both elementary, middle, and I should say even high school, and they are extremely unstable in terms of their financing. We have spent an enormous amount of time over the last 2 years ensuring their financial stability. We need to get to a point where we've stopped talking about how to shore them up, but actually how to expand access points for healthcare. The third piece of work that we're doing is really focused on improving school culture and climate through restorative practices. I think we are extremely pleased with the mayor's announcement around school discipline changes. I think it's a great step in the right direction. We know that restorative justice works, however. I don't think we need to pilot, but it's a great start, and we need to expand it and use it much more often. We at the Children's Defense Fund have been working with school safety agents to really focus on training them around restorative practice, but to also understand the repercussions of what happens to young people when they become justice involved as a result of an incident in school. And I think another big piece of our work is quite shocking. I'm not sure how many of you know this, but New York State is one of 2 states that at the age of 16 you can be arrested and incarcerated as an adult, and the other being North Carolina. And every year, about 33,000 black and brown, largely boys, are affected across the state, and most here in New York City, by this policy. Most of these young people, as you know, wind up in Rikers, as Maya talked about, and there's a lot of reform that's happening at the city level to address this, but at the state level, we have been very involved with pushing the governor to really change this practice, and we're hopeful that that will happen this session. As I've been to Albany almost, I think, once every week, this last couple of weeks, and we're hopeful to change that practice. And then I think there's also continuing to support the work of the administration around the expansion of community schools, pre-K, the school discipline work, as I mentioned, and then the Young Men's Initiative, which is expanded with a focus in particular on early literacy. So all of those pieces definitely play a role. But I think, you know, to answer the question about whether or not in an Obama era have things changed, I think it goes back to Maya's point, which is the real question is looking at have outcomes changed for Black and Latino boys and young men. In a state where 1 in 3 Black boys continues to be poor, and we know that there are issues, there are things that we can do to address this at the federal and state level, you know, I think that's the real question to ask and the real effort that needs to happen. So.
So good morning. I want to rephrase the question first and say that we have to ask ourselves, what is there about being Black and or Latino and male in America that results in these greater risks? Right? And I frame it that way because I think that if we rush to solutions before we understand the nature of the problem that we're trying to address, that we will find that the problem doesn't go away. I would also add, and this is an important caution, that while we're focusing on young men of color, we should not think that girls and women are just fine, right? I mean, I think Kimberly Crenshaw's work recently in drawing attention to the particular challenges facing young Black women is particularly important. To me, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't focus on boys, but we should, not at the expense of girls, right? And we don't have to choose one or the other. We need to do both, right? So this is also very important. The second question is, what is there about the nature of schools? Why is it that instead of being a source of support, many times schools are the place where the risks are first manifest and where the problems are exacerbated? What is there about the way schools function? Now, I pose the questions this way because I would agree with what Melanie just said, that I think we have to look at this issue in a holistic manner, in a comprehensive manner. This is one of the things that concerns me. I'm sorry that Maya's not here because I think that the mayor's initiative is a piecemeal initiative, right? That it approaches it, you know, through, as the mayor has done in a number of areas, initiatives, right? But failing to have a real strategy, right? And I think it's ironic that on the one hand, the mayor would run and say inequality is the issue for New York, but then not lay out a strategy what we're going to do about inequality, right? Now, to speak to Melanie's point, I think while poverty is certainly a major factor in this, it's not the only factor. Because there are a lot of boys of color who are not in poverty, who are also not thriving in schools, right? And the data suggests that as well. Not graduating, that is, class does not work in the same ways that you would expect, right, for this population. So something else is going on beyond this. And I would say, and we spent a lot of time trying to study this and understand it, that I would attribute it to both to a history, right? A history of racial oppression, right? That's rooted in slavery, that's targeted men in particular as a threat, right? Black men and to some degree Latino men as a threat that needs to be dealt with in a different manner, right? But I would say beyond history, the structural factors that Maya spoke to earlier are critical in all of this. That is the lack of jobs. Right now in New York City alone, 25 to 30% of young men of color between the ages of 16 and 25 are disconnected. They're not in school, they're not at work, and they're either in the criminal justice system or they are primed to join, right? That is, this issue, to me, is one of the critical issues. First, how do we prevent young men from entering the ranks of this disenfranchised population, but what do we do about the ones that are already there? Right? And again, that's not something you're going to solve through simply a number of discrete initiatives. Now, I want to give Melanie and the former Young Men's Initiative some credit for having done some concrete things, right? Which, like the development of new schools. We did a study on the graduation rate of young men of color, Black and Latino men, boys in the city, and we found in a city with a rising graduation rate, it wasn't rising to the same degree for this population, and especially when you look at college readiness, it was still lower, less than 15% graduating college ready. However, we also found about 30 schools in the city which had graduation rates of over 80% of Black and Latino males. So our question became, what are these schools doing differently? And why aren't we doing more of that? And at least one strand of the YMI was to figure out how do we replicate that work. And I'm sure David Banks will speak more about that later on the panel. But I think that speaks to where we might start to find both a preventative strategy that might help us in breaking the cycle of disenfranchisement, but also point to ways in which we can start to tackle some of the structural issues. But I have to again say we can't do this through education alone. One of the things I will fault the previous YMI with was stop and frisk was never, they explicitly said it's not on the agenda, we're not going to touch that. Which meant that this whole system of incarcerating young men of color, of using the police, because it wasn't simply the suspension rate, it was the way in which the police were being deployed to schools to arrest young people for offenses that were never even seen as criminal before, right? And starting a process of criminalization. That was never addressed. Now, my hope is that the current mayor will start to tackle it, but simply telling schools to reduce suspensions is not sufficient, right? I was talking to the principal of Boys and Girls High School, which has one of the highest suspension rates in the city, and he said very simply, we suspend because we lack other resources. Right? What are the other resources? Social workers, counselors, right? People who can get at the roots of the problems. If you can't solve this simply by saying don't suspend or through a nice restorative justice program. Right? You have to get at the roots of the problem and start to tackle that and keep these young people connected and provide the resources so that they can be successful without hurting others in school, right? Because that's the other issue, is safety. So my concern in the way we address this is that we don't fully respond to the many different sides of this issue. I'm waiting for this mayor to launch a jobs initiative specifically directed at this population. Right? That would be huge. As I heard, I mean, all the data shows people who are employed, people who can support themselves, much less likely to go to jail. Right? Well, why not a major initiative around jobs, targeting neighborhoods? You know, the poverty rates, all you have to do is look at certain neighborhoods like Brownsville, South Bronx. You name the neighborhood, that's where poverty is concentrated. That's where some criminologists call these $1 million blocks, because the amount of money being spent in the criminal justice system to incarcerate people from those neighborhoods specifically. So we need a neighborhood strategy. And again, while I support the community schools work, that has to be part of a larger, more systemic effort. I keep saying, why didn't mayoral control? Right? They wanted control of the schools. Bloomberg wanted it. De Blasio wants it. Why doesn't it result in different city departments working together? so that we have the health department working with the schools, working with the employment departments, working together to develop a more systemic approach. And I haven't yet seen that articulated as a strategy. I've seen right now there's a group working in the South Bronx called South Bronx Rising Together that's trying to do it, but it's actually happening outside of city government through the nonprofit sector. And I think it's going to need a lot more support. The other thing I think that's key to keep in mind is that while the structural barriers are important, there are also cultural factors at work here. Right? Orlando Patterson, a sociologist at Harvard, has a new book out called The Cultural Matrix. He'll actually be speaking this week at NYU about it. And he raises the ways in which culture and structure interact, right? That end up reinforcing a kind of self-destructive behavior amongst this population. And we have to acknowledge and address that part of it as well. That is that what results in so many young men at early ages becoming turned off to learning, becoming turned off to or unwilling or unable to establish strong, positive relationships with women, right? Which then contributes to a cycle of fatherless families. Right? If we don't have strategies to address these factors, the values and norms that reproduce them, we're missing out on a critical part of all this. And then lastly, there's the question of agency. Right? Americans like to point to the rugged individual, grit. We love this concept of grit, this person who is able to overcome obstacles. I often point out the people in New York City I think have the most grit are the delivery guys who ride their bikes in the snow. And guess what? They're still broke, right? All the grit in the world without opportunity does not change your life circumstances. What we need is not simply to develop that grit and persistence. We need to connect people to opportunity, structural opportunities, but also with opportunities to challenge the mindset that lets some young people at an early age believe that prison is where they're heading. It's a rite of passage, right, for many young men. And that if we don't change that, we're not going to change very much. Thank you.
Well, let me first of all congratulate Warren and Kirkland on your 2-volume work. I think it's an important contribution, so I'm glad to see you guys got that out. All minds matter. I mean, that's, if you want to know why we have the problem, you can sum it up with that phrase, all minds matter. Yes, but all minds don't matter equally in this society. They never have, and they don't now. In a nutshell, that's why we have that problem, and we have this aspirational hope. It's not a statement of fact. It's a prayer that all minds matter. They simply don't. We were asked to think about, or to talk a little bit about why we got into this field of work, if that's what it is for me. I didn't have a choice. I mean, I was born into it. I was born a young black baby in America. And I didn't want to get into this kind of work. I mean, when I was in high school, I actually thought I was going to be a mathematician of all things. But the riots, I came in Chicago and the riots intervened. And I remember reading the Chicago Tribune, which was one of the hometown papers. When I came up, Chicago actually had 5 daily newspapers. But I remember reading the reporting on the riot on the West Side where I happened to live. And it described the West Side as a jungle. And it described the people in it as basically denizens of the jungle. And I remember being so struck by that and thinking it's so poorly reflected the community that I knew and the people that I knew, that I wanted to make it part of my mission to sort of change that image, change that idea of how that community was defined, of who these people were. So I became a professional writer at the age of 18. I became a columnist for the Chicago Sun-Times, and so that's how I got into this kind of work. As I said, if it is work. In terms of this subject, I think I got really engaged in it. I published a book several years back called The Envy of the World, which was a tribute in a sense to James Baldwin's A Letter to My Nephew. But it was a look at what's going on, with young black men, in this country, and it was both a personal take, but also a more objective take. And in doing research for that, and this touches on something Pedro was talking about, in doing research for that, I remember coming across a fellow in Washington who was running a program that was aimed at poor men in a particular community. And he said that one of the things he had noticed was that, and this program dealt with people beginning at kindergarten, and one of the things he noticed was that as young as 5 and 6 years old, when he had the boys and the girls in the class, and they were singing the ABC song, the A, B, C, D, singing that song, the girls were singing along cheerfully, and the boys were not. And so he pulled some of the boys aside, and he said, well, why aren't you guys singing this song? And the answer was, well, that's not what boys do. I mean, they had received the message that early, at least in this institution, that educational achievement was just not something that boys do, at least not these boys. Last month marked the 1-year anniversary of My Brother's Keeper initiative, which is the President Obama plan, initiative aimed at young black and Latino men. And we were asked to reflect a little bit as well in the questions we were given about what this issue means in the age of Obama. And I think it becomes a little bit more complicated in some sense, at least. I did a book recently where I did a couple of surveys, one of graduates of A Better Chance, and I see Sandra Timmons in the audience who heads that, but also of graduates of Harvard Business School. And one of the questions that I asked in the survey had to do, several questions actually had to do with Obama and how Obama's presidency played out along the issues of opportunity for African Americans. And 86% of respondents in my survey from Harvard Business School graduates, and these are black respondents, said that they thought that the election of Obama had given white folks the impression that blacks had made more progress than we have. And I think it's difficult to talk about the impact of this in the age of Obama without talking about that. It's not just that Obama himself is an exception and allows people to point to him and say, wait, well, if he did this, why can't you? It's that there's this whole impression that because of what he represents, the problem's been dealt with. And to some extent, I would submit, to some extent at least, I think his whole election or the whole excitement around his candidacy was an attempt to be able to, was driven by an aspiration to be able to say, this problem's solved. We got this guy in office. A black person can be president of the United States. We don't need to deal with this anymore. We've been dealing with this for hundreds of years. Damn it, we're done. We're through now. Unfortunately, it's a little bit more complicated than that. But I think part of the problem, and this gets to what Warren was talking about. I agree with you, Warren, that yes, it is possible to work consciously unbiased. It is possible to change these attitudes, but you need to want to change these attitudes in order for that to happen. And I think the problem that we have as a society is that we don't want to change our attitudes. We don't believe we have these attitudes. We don't really recognize that we have a problem. And as a consequence, black men end up paying the price. Years ago, Mayor Koch and I had this sort of ongoing discussion and debate about what needed to be done with the problems of race in America, and specifically some of the problems of black men. And Koch would argue that what the black community needs, are kibbutzes. And I remember disagreeing vigorously with him because his whole idea was you need to have basically a whole, you need to just take them totally out of their context, put them in a whole different environment, and then just start everything totally anew. And we would vigorously disagree about this. But the fact of the matter is, the more that I think about what he had to say, though I still don't think we need to take young black men and put them all in kibbutzes, I think he was onto something. Because the question, one of the questions that was raised, was how does race interact with the issues of the achievement gap? How does it not? I mean, that's really the question. I mean, we have a society that is still highly racially segregated, and one in which opportunity is mated out by race. There are a whole series of studies which talk, a number of them have been alluded to, which talk about disciplining of young black men, which talk about opportunities. If a young black person applies for a job, the odds of his getting that job are roughly equivalent. If he does not have a conviction to that of a young white man who has a criminal conviction. We talk about names. If you have a name that quote looks black, then you're much less likely to be hired, significantly less hired, or even interviewed than someone who isn't. Where does race not count in this society? If you want to be more specific, it seems to me we have, two big realities. One is of the messages that young African Americans are given within the community and outside the community about what is possible and what should be aspired to. And the other is the whole question of access. One of the effects of having a highly segregated society is there are lots of people who could in fact do quite well if they had access to the tools that would allow them to do very well. The fact of the matter is that we just don't. Short story. My daughter is now 12, but several years ago, when she was I think, quite a bit younger, she was trying to get her head around Black History Month. And she came to me and she said, Daddy, why do black people have a special month? And I said, okay, this is a teachable moment, a nice time to sort of get some history into our discussion. So I took her through what I thought was a very short and succinct and interesting explanation of slavery and Jim Crow and the whole racial history of America and why that meant that we deserved a special month to reflect and talk about that. And she patiently listened. And at the end of it, she looked at me again and she says, well, Daddy, when all this was happening, when they were, these mean people were like taking people from Africa and making them into slaves and all this sort of stuff. Did they have a black president then? The point is that she had a hard time believing, first of all, this stuff could happen in a sane society, but secondly, she had a hard time envisioning an America in which there couldn't be a black president. But the fact of the matter is that we as a society have a hard time remembering that most of through American history has not been possible for a black person to be president. We want to forget that. We want to ignore that. We want to deny that. And as a consequence, we don't really want to grapple with this problem.
My name is Howard Steele. I work in the psychology department here at the New School for Social Research. I learned today that one of my beliefs is wrong. I've been telling people that the New School for Social Research is the founding part of the New School. Our initial speaker, the Dean of the New School for Public Engagement, corrected me on that. I want to thank Kirkland and Warren for inviting me to be part of this meeting. I want to say something about the perspective from which I work, which is attachment theory. And I want to talk about 3 intervention programs that address the important points raised by my co-panelists. First of all, concerning poverty and children under the age of 3. I also want to talk about preschool and what does it mean to universalize that, the challenges of that. And I'll also talk about an after-school program known and run by the I Have a Dream Foundation that is in 70 cities across the America, and has an impressive track record at bringing high school graduation rates up to 80, 90%. But first of all, the attachment theory perspective is is radical, radically different from many assumptions in American and Western life. We live, as we've heard today, under certain pressures to show grit and be independent and be self-reliant, and with an idea about human development that it's about initially being dependent, and that the job of parents is to encourage the child to become independent and self-reliant and stand on his or her own 2 feet. The attachment perspective turns that upside down, maybe has something more in common with collectivist cultures, as they have been written about, and says that dependency is a characteristic of human life from the cradle to the grave. This was John Bowlby's perspective. And that what every child deserves, what every child needs, whatever color of skin or wherever the child is born, every child needs to experience one or more caregivers who communicate to the child a sense of safe haven. You can turn to me if you're distressed, if you're confused, if you're upset. I'm here for you. And at the same time, I'm a secure base that is going to encourage you to play, to learn, and to explore. And we function best, as has been said, when we're working or studying in a context that's supportive and enjoyable, and when our relationships are going well, initially in our family of origin. And we carry those influences throughout the lifespan. You'll remember that President Obama, on the first Father's Day in the Oval Office, he remarked on that Father's Day something deeply personal. He acknowledged that there's a hole in his soul at the center of his being in respect of his father, that he had very limited knowledge, contact with throughout his development. And this is a problem universally. In the 0 to 3 age group here in New York City, known to ACS's preventive services, there are more than 20,000 infants and toddlers. Overrepresented among them are infants and toddlers from communities of color. And I want to talk briefly about an intervention I'm involved in with some very gifted clinicians at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine that I've been working with for 8 or 10 years, where with those children known to preventive services, at risk of protective services getting involved and removing the child to foster care, they are delivering something called a group attachment-based intervention, providing a secure base and a safe haven to vulnerable parents, mostly mothers who come because the fathers are typically incarcerated. Sometimes there's a protection order against the father's involvement because of domestic violence. Sometimes the fathers come as well because becoming a parent is a fresh start opportunity. There isn't a parent in the world who doesn't hope to become good enough, as good or better than the parents that he or she knew as children. But these parents in the Bronx are children of the crack cocaine epidemic of the late 80s and 90s. They're children who grew up with some of the things that have been remarked on by the panel, toxic stress and adverse childhood experiences. But these are sanitizing words for child abuse and neglect, physical, sexual abuse, household dysfunction, growing up with a parent who is addicted to alcohol or drugs, growing up with a parent who has a physical or mental health problem. And we know that children who grow up in the first 18 years of life with 4 or more of the exposure to these kinds of abuse and household neglect, including separation and divorce, 4 or more of those adversities is associated with adverse health outcomes. Not just psychological problems like suicide, depression, anxiety, but also physical health problems, diabetes, cancer, fractures, heart disease. What is the group attachment-based intervention that is helping these children 0 to 3? It's saying to mothers, Latina mothers are the largest number in the group, African American, white mothers as well, and mixed race families. They come and they're told, you can come 3 times a week. You can come in the morning. If you want to come to the afternoon session, you can come as well. And in the form that it should be delivered, it's a provision until the child starts preschool. We live under, I live under the obligations of scientific research. So we're doing a randomly controlled trial now, comparing the group attachment-based intervention with treatment as usual. What is treatment as usual? Parenting groups. When we began this work, we called up 20 sites in the Bronx who deliver parenting groups. What's your model? 18 didn't answer the phone. 2 that did answer the phone, they weren't sure what the model was. But we know about it from the mothers who come to the group attachment-based intervention. They say they've been to a number of those parenting classes. They get a certificate at the end. There's talk about anger management and parenting strategies, and sometimes a video about domestic violence, but the child's not there. It's once a week for 10 weeks. You get a certificate. The women who come to our group attachment-based intervention say they could paper the walls with those certificates. Well, last week, thanks to a grant from the New York Health Foundation, we had a 2-day face-to-face training here at the new school with 10 sites around the state, teaching them the elements of the group attachment-based intervention. Essentially, teaching parents of children under the age of 3 that what your child needs is sensitivity from you, synchrony, following his lead and responding, and the child needs not to be afraid of you. And we know that that's the most toxic influence on the life experience of a small child, if they're afraid of the very person that they need most in the world. And unfortunately, too often, parents believe that if I don't draw the line and be harsh, be physically punitive, the child won't respect me. And so there is this belief that violence demands respect. And I think we have to attack that at its core and let parents and teachers and educators know that that's not the answer. Expulsion is not the answer. So with preschools, I wanted to make the point that it's great to roll out preschools and make universal experience of school available to 4-year-olds, but not if the people delivering the care aren't informed and don't have mental health consultation available with them. So I'm involved with a program called Relationships for Growth and Learning, which is a mental health consultation service to daycares and preschool. There's working with parents, working with teachers, working with children to help them understand that attachment message. And then the other thing I've been involved in over my 10, 11 years at the new school is working, as many faculty in the new school do work with, the I Have a Dream Foundation. It was the brainchild of Eugene Lang, one of the trustees of the new school, when he went back to his high school in Washington Heights, as I understand the story, 25, 30 years ago, and realized that the young people are not graduating high school, that 30, 40% might graduate. He wondered what's happening to the rest. He started this program. It says they locate themselves at schools in places where children, families are living with poverty, typically immigrant families and often communities of color. And they say to those parents, let your child come to this after-school program in first grade. They can come through elementary school, they can come through high school. We'll help them to apply for college, and we'll help them get funding to go there. And as I said at the start, that's in 70 cities across the country. And I really think we just have to open our eyes. And when I was still a high school student in Vancouver, Canada, where I grew up, before I went over to England and spent some 20 years, I was impressed by some words of James Baldwin, who said, "Let us not look forward in fear nor back in anger, but around in awareness." Thank you.
Well, thank you, panelists. What I'd like to do now is open it up for a question and answer. We have about 10 minutes, so if you have questions you'd like to ask the panelists, I invite you to come up to the microphones and form a line where we have on either ends of the room.
Hi, I just want to make a quick comment and get your thinking. My name is Thomas Lopez Pierre, and the qualifying factors, I'm a candidate for City Council in Upper Manhattan. I'm a real estate broker and asset manager, and I am a father of 3 kids. My son just got 4 out of 4 on his statewide exams, and I live on the Upper West Side in a great building. I say all that because I was born addicted to heroin. I grew up in Bushwick, Brooklyn, gang infested. I was sent through group homes and foster homes. And the only reason I made it to college was because I cut class, and a teacher found me in the hallway and sent me to, John Jay was in my school of recruiting. So instead of lying, I said, oh yeah, I'm going for that. And I sat there and listened to that and decided to sign up. So I should be a statistic. I should be dead or either in jail or selling drugs, which is actually the way my twin brother went. He was shot and killed by NYPD. The point I'd like for you guys to talk about is I made it through the cracks by luck, just pure luck, because of 4 or 5 public school teachers. They saved my life. I was suspended by 3 or 4 high schools, and I had a very violent relationship with my school and the group home and the community. And the only reason I made it was by pure luck. I left the group home at 21 and bought a co-op. It wasn't with drug money, it was from being an entrepreneur. And since then, I've never had to look back. My question for the panelists is, could you talk about how we can stop this black men making it by luck? And because they point to me and they say, oh, you made it, you picked yourself up from your bootstraps, and that's just like the biggest lie, and it's painful when I hear it for me. So could you talk about how we can make it just the same way white kids make it, through a structural, caring, loving society? Oh, and the last thing I'll add is I never met my mother, so I know what it is. The doctor talked about I wasn't hugged. Thank you. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, let me just take a quick stab at starting this discussion. And congratulations on your journey, first of all. And secondly, I would disagree a little bit with your analysis of why you made it. I don't think you made it because of luck. I think you were lucky. But I think you made it because obviously some people interceded on your behalf at some important points, or you got into some programs that allowed you to achieve something. I mean, I think that's why you made it. And if we look at least in my experience of looking at what really separates those of us who got out from those of us who didn't, it has a lot to do with there being access provided by some institution, by some person who allows us to see a better and a different way. Whether it's the Harlem Education activities, activities in New York, whether it's a better chance, whether it's a counselor at a boys club, it's usually somebody or something that you can point to that made a difference. Sometimes it's a parent. I mean, so I would just respectfully say that it wasn't just luck. It's not luck. Luck is an important component. But the question for me is, how do you structure those kinds of opportunities across the board so that it's not just luck that we happen to get into them or get exposed to them?
I just wanted to add that I agree with you. I don't think it was luck at all, and I think you said it yourself, which is you had several mentors. And so part of what we did with the Young Men's Initiative was really make mentoring an intentional part of the work, so that it wasn't just by chance that young men who had an opportunity, who had a teacher, but that there was actual funding behind programs to really provide mentoring services. And mentoring runs the gamut. So you can have unpaid mentors, paid mentors, mentors that work with kids who are just as involved, who are very much at risk for recidivism. But I think mentoring is a key component of any strategy, and it's actually evidence-based. I think people often hear of mentoring and roll their eyes and think that it's not, it's just about some person who's decided to be, kind and give their time, and that's actually not true. It's actually based in a lot of evidence that we know that mentoring works.
I would just add, though, that I think as important as mentoring is, that we need support systems that go beyond mentoring, so that we're looking at institutions as well, schools, preschool, health systems, to provide support so that we change the odds. So there are lots of stories like yours. We like to celebrate those and say proof that you can do it. But to change the odds, we need a support system in place early that goes from birth. I mean, that's why the kaput's idea is not so far-fetched. If the other question I would raise was, he willing to put any money into creating it, right? Or just say, go do it. I mean, part of the problem here is that we define this a lot of times as a black problem, right? Instead of as an American problem, right? And if you don't define it or as a New York City problem in those ways, then you don't really start to put the resources in place to begin to change the odds for a larger number of kids.
Thank you. I think the remarks that caught my attention were around the home-based care and the concern about places that are not certified by the city and what types of interventions and educational programs are being put in. And it raised a bit of a red flag for me because I'm really wondering if further government intervention into what's happening there is truly going to be the best for these families. Is there something else that's community-based that's happening? Is there any pushback on that or other options being looked at to support these young kids? Because I think there are a lot of people who came out of home-based, care that wasn't certified and are doing just fine. So I was always a little bit concerned when we talk a little bit more about government interventions and yeah.
So let me just be clear and say that the home-based care system is a completely important part of the network of delivering early care services. We're never going to get to a point, I think, in any city across this country where we have center-based care being the primary source of care for children. It's just not a reality for a whole host of reasons. And it's also important to note that home-based care, is preferable for children, especially young children ages 0 to 3. And in fact, 2 of my 3 at very early ages were in home-based care and family child care. The point that I'm bringing up is not so much about government intervention, but it's about how do you provide the right supports and services to home-based care providers that can uplift the quality that's happening in their homes in the provision of their care. Most of the care that's provided in homes, the vast majority, is by a family, friend, or neighbor. That's a critical support system for parents. They often rely on that type of care, especially if you are a poor family who are working non-traditional hours. It is very hard to find care that's provided by licensed family or even center-based care that meets those hours. So this is not about demonizing home-based providers and saying that we need more government intervention, but it's about how do you provide appropriate supports and services. And I think here in New York City, the UFT, who's done a tremendous job of really working with home-based providers to get them first unionized, to get appropriate wages paid to them because they are sorely underpaid, but 2, to provide them with quality training as a critical partner in that endeavor. And so I think it's the start. I think the next step is how do we really make investments in home-based care?
I would say reflective supervision groups for the people delivering home-based care is vital. And I think it's probably a form of center-based care that I was advocating, but I was talking about the people at the sort of lowest rung of the ladder, who half of the families we work with in the group attachment-based intervention, home is not a safe place. Half are living in shelters, and a few years ago, more were in rented accommodation, but it wasn't viable to do home visiting in that context. It was much more recommended to provide them with a safe base in a kind of clinic or hospital setting. But there's no shortage of families in need of support, and I think there's a place for both home-based and center-based care, especially in a crowded, urban, and sometimes dangerous neighborhood.
Good morning. My name is Michael Adolphus. I'm the founder and president of Amen Ministries Incorporated, which is a Good morning. My name is Michael Adolphus. I'm a founder and president of Amen Ministries Incorporated, which is a mentoring program. Now, one of the things that I feel is hard for me as developing the program is that a lot of programs don't work together. They're working apart. And I think that if all the programs have access to with the same information together, then instead of us working against each other, we could work together with each other, because you said that it's a national, or not national, but you mentioned that it affects us all together. It's not really a black problem or a Latino problem, but it's a American problem. So therefore, if we could sit up here and get the information together, because that's one of the things I came up here to ask. I don't have the access to information. I don't have access to the resources. That's one of the things that we talked about, lack of access. How can I get access? How can I get help so that way I can have the information that's needed, so that way in my community I'm able to teach the people that's a part of my program, and even help other programs and share the same information with them. Because once again, it's not, for me, it's not about I succeed. It's about all of us succeeding together, because in all actuality, if I succeed, that's only one step. But if we all have the same information, if we all could succeed together, then we have more impact on the community, as opposed to just me trying. Because I only could reach, let's say, I'm using an example, maybe I might could reach 100 people. But if there are so many community-based programs that have the same information, have access to the same resources, then we could reach thousands and hundreds of thousands. So basically my question is this: how can I get the access and the resources? Because that's what I'm lacking. I'm trying my best with the little bit of information that I know, and I say a little bit, but with all of your knowledge, I was inspired now to try to get more information. But how can I? But once again, it's not just about me having it, it's about other organizations and programs having information, so that we can help at a mass worldwide impact. Amen? I mean,
Let's hear from 2 or 3 of you on that. 2 of you.
So again, I don't want to at all downplay the importance of mentorship. I think that what you're doing now is a great start. What we need is a strategy, a neighborhood, place-based strategy that goes beyond that can reinforce your work. And that's what, Harlem Children's Zone has in effect done that. Now, a lot of people look at that and say, well, how can you replicate that? And that's a problem, because it's so expensive, and the way they've done it. What they're trying to do now in the South Bronx is to replicate it at a much, much cheaper way, which, in my opinion, if we can do that in the South Bronx, then we can take that to East New York and to other neighborhoods across the city where the need is great. We need models that create these systems, where mentorship is a part of it, but so is the kind of interventions that we've heard already that work directly with families and others. So if you can, speak to, maybe it's your city council member, I'm not sure where the leadership will come from at the neighbor level, but that's what we need to begin to change the patterns that we're seeing.
Thank you. I'm impressed with today's discussion. You hit on a number of points that I didn't think would be mentioned at all. I wrote a paper about 25 years ago, in the early mid-90s, comparing educational outcomes and achievements of African American and Hispanic kids compared to their white social class counterparts. And African American parents engage with their kids less. African American kids watch more television than their social class counterparts. They play more computer games than their social class counterparts, and their parents talk with their kids. They converse with their kids less. It's a huge problem. It doesn't require resources. I organized people when I was living in Connecticut to do informal stage readings of children's stories. Take something like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and get about 30 to 60 parents and kids, adults and kids together, and put them in the chapters by the number of characters in each chapter, and have each small group present their chapter any way they liked, as a play, as a narrative, as an improvisation, and kids see adults playing with literature, playing with characters. And it gives them a way for them to play differently than the way they normally do on the streets. You could do the same thing with math and science and history. How many young African American kids are taking on nature walks, even on a nature walk in your neighborhood? It doesn't happen, but it happens among. I'm sure you raise your own children far more imaginatively than the kids that you serve in the various programs that you administer. And that's the
excuse me, sir. Do you have a question for our panel?
This is the last.
Okay.
Parents cannot be allowed to think that simply by sending their kids to school that they have fulfilled their obligation to educate their children. No matter how many jobs you have to make time to engage your kids in education. And until that happens, poor kids will always fail. They'll always be on the bottom of the socioeconomic status hierarchy.
Okay. Thank you. And our last question.
My name is Peter Goodman. I write a blog called That in the Apple. Each week I speak with a colleague, a friend who's a middle school principal in Brownsville. And in preparation for this conference, I asked them, what's the profile of a kid who you have to suspend? And he said he didn't go to pre-K, he's overage, he's chronically absent, which means absent more than 20% of the time. He probably has a single parent, he spent some time in foster care. In other words, all these high risk factors which push the kid in a certain direction. And he says his job as principal is to make his kids bicultural, which means the culture of the streets and the culture of the school, to be able to function in both cultures. I go to Albany once a month to listen to the Regents meetings. They only talk about academic achievement, reading scores, and things of that sort. So the people who are determining the policy by which schools are assessed are only concerned with how kids did on reading and math tests, yet everybody in this room knows that the real factors are totally different. A simple and easy question: how do we impact changing the mindset of the policymakers?
So I just want to take a brief, I think it's a great question, because in policy circles in general, there's always been a lack of the person represented. That people are making, lawmakers are making policies about education, criminal justice, without really knowing people in a very profound way. They haven't heard them, they haven't listened, they haven't been in schools long enough, or maybe ever. They don't know what kids need, they don't know what adults need, and so there is that gap. I don't know how to really breach the gap, but maybe we have to think about getting people who are making policies to actually spend more times in the institutions that they want to change. Now, I'm a clinician, so for me, it's one kid at a time. And so, we're talking a lot about structure and culture, but there are things called resilience. Now, resilience, by the way, disappears after you load on all the structural factors like poverty and abuse, and it ends up being an American myth. But there is something about people, and maybe I want us to even think about it. What the people that we know who have made it, what is it about them? Yes, somebody was there to help them, but they also invited somebody in. And also I find that the kids I work with, they have some kind of imagination, some kind of dream. Again, these are ways I think we all have to think more about it. There's more to the story about why some people make it. But going back to your question, yes, and also what Pedro remarked, as a first step, we have to supply a lot more clinical services in schools. And my first job was a school psychologist, and it hasn't changed much in 25 years, where they're there to test, and they're not there working with kids. I got punished for working with kids. That's why I ended up having to leave the Board of Education. Anyway, those are some of my...
I'm not sure there's a simple answer to that simple question, how to get policymakers to make better policy in effect. But I will make this observation, which is that it's become the thing now, and to have these male or black and Latino male, these initiatives. We have one in the city here. Obviously, the president has started one. There are several other cities that have them. The Searles Foundation has spun off a foundation to look at this set of issues. I think that's really a question that has to be engaged now, particularly with all these initiatives. Where are these things going? What is going to happen to make them into something other than some disjointed efforts that try in some piecemeal way to accomplish something? I mean, clearly there is a societal recognition that something needs to be done. So the question really is, how do you take that recognition and amplify that and focus some of these initiatives that are already in place and in play?
Can I just add one more thing? Because I alluded to it before. Think about AIDS, right? There was a time when all the research on AIDS and HIV was about looking for a vaccine. And then suddenly they started to realize, you know what, maybe we can't find a vaccine, but we can build the immune system. And that's the reason why today people are living with HIV, right? Is because they found ways to build up the immune system, right? Now, again, we could talk about who doesn't get it and all that, so there's still huge problems related to that. Let's say the same thing with Ebola, right? What did they have to do to really start to stem the tide of Ebola? They had to build a public health system in these countries because they didn't have one, right? So that's what we got to think about. We can't, the piecemeal approach that Ellis just talked to, I mean, this is the reason what policymakers don't get. We're focusing on achievement in isolation, right? And we're not looking at what's happening in the lives of kids. And that's never going to work. So we need a more systemic approach. We need an approach that goes beyond what schools do to looking at what communities do. And we've got to educate our elected officials. I want to credit this current administration for recognizing, and I think that's what the Community Schools Initiative represents, that they need a bigger strategy. I just think it could even be bigger than that.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for your questions. And what we'll do now is we'll take a quick 10-15-minute break or so. And I invite you to please stay. Our next panel is a group of young men who are here from an organization called Exalt. And in the meantime, please tweet, please use our social media hashtag, All Minds Matter, and I invite you to engage in the conversation online as well as during the break that we have now. Thank you.